Do you know what nuclear submarines have in common with the real estate industry? Find out now. Today, we talk with Neil Uebelein, who once lived under the sea and went on to found a prop tech company at just the right time.
The biggest one for people that work from home is to stay connected. So a
Mhm.
lot of times out within that personal network, people that push you, people that give you, advice, kind of check you in, just critically important. But it's
Mm.
having a balance and a variety in your time, because don't wind up as a node like a spoke.
Hello, and welcome to the Lease Alert, where we have conversations with the smartest, most interesting people at the intersection of real estate, leasing, and accounting. I'm your host, Matt Waters. Let's learn something together. All right, well, let's dive right in. So, Neil, I know you're now a successful prop tech entrepreneur. You're the founder of nVision, and we're going to talk a lot more about that in a few minutes here. But first off, I know you started out in a very different profession. If you're watching this instead of just listening, you can see that Neil has a hat on that mentions the U.S. Navy. So that might be a clue. But tell us about your first job, Neil, and actually how you started your career.
Technically, my first job in high school, I was journalism. My first degree choice was journalism, which is far apart from what I'm known for now, which is more engineering and systems and math oriented things. So my first real job, to your point, is U.S. Navy on board nuclear submarines. I was a nuclear power plant operator, and point of trivia, I think 1986, which you get a wealth of experience by being a little bit older. I will just say that's a different way. But 1986, the first day I saw the sun was March 3rd. So
Oh,
all of
wow.
January, February underwater. So that kind of, as a young person, gives you a little bit different perspective. But that's where it all began, technically.
Wow, no kidding. 3 months underwater. Tell me a little bit, what did you learn as a part of that experience? I mean, you mentioned it's vastly different than what you do now, but what did you learn in
Yeah.
the Navy that you've carried with you for these years after that?
I think looking back, it's an interesting thing. And it was after I was out of the Navy, a friend of mine shared with me that one of the life lessons, or one of the training lessons, is that nukes are trained to learn. And if
Hmm.
you look now going forward, in this day and age where most careers begin, where you're thinking about, you're probably going to recycle your job content, 5 different times, 6 different times over the course of a career. It's not like the old days where you became an accountant and that you did a narrow set of accounting for an entire career. So a big one was just trained to learn. Another one was that there was an absolute accountability in the Navy nuclear power program. I went in at 19, just to give you an idea. And you're basically taking 19-year-olds and over the course of a year or two, training them such that they can go out and run an incredibly complex machine underwater for months at a time, and crew of about 150. And
Hmm.
you were expected to have absolute knowledge. And one of the real things is that you were taught to really have instincts to recognize what you don't know.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the biggest parts of learning is where do you go? And even in software now, we look at, what's changing, how are things changing, but really just the ability to go out and acquire knowledge. And so it's that, what do being trained to learn, being able to recognize what you don't know, and then an absolute accountability for knowledge factors. And then the last piece of that, because when you're running a nuclear power plant, there's all kinds of integrated, interrelated systems. It's knowing everything has a primary effect. You're going to turn a switch, you're going to do something. We were expected to know what's every secondary impact of that. And we get quizzed on it, drilled on it. And so when we think now in terms of system design, we're looking at everything as an integrated system, an integrated whole. So you have to have
Hmm.
a holistic view of how these pieces come together. And I think in some ways, still, that's probably a formative experience that defines what nVision is
Yeah,
as a company, as a software company. Is still kind of rooted in those principles taken from that long ago.
that's great. That's something to take with you. Nukes are trained to learn. And when you say nukes, you're talking about a nuclear submarine operator. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, there's three primary disciplines in there.
Hmm.
There's mechanical people that work on the fluid and water and the hydraulic systems, electricians, which is I
Hmm.
was at 20 years old working on high voltage electrical distribution systems that supported the running of a reactor plant, and then electronics, the controls and the fine-tuned controls around it. And those were the three disciplines long ago. And the submarine, it's a little bit eerie. The submarine I was on, which I've actually aged better than it. We were debated whether I could show, but in the shipyards walking out, a welder tucked a piece, but the pressure hull. I'm aware of one other officer who was gifted one of these, so I'm assuming it's okay to have. But you can see the water side with a little bit of rust. Unfortunately for me, the people side of that hull. If you look at the logo in the background, kind of the circumference of the hull, it's a couple of inches of steel that separated about 150 people of all disciplines, sonar,
Wow.
communications, cooks, from the water, from the safer space inside. So
Oh man, unbelievable. You know, this reminds me actually of a book I read recently. The book was called Thunder Below, and the author is Admiral Eugene Fluckey, I think is the right way to
yeah,
say that. Are you familiar?
not that book. Of course, when
Yeah.
I got out, right as I was getting out, I think around that time, Hunt for Red October, some of the other
Hmm.
books that fictionalized life on a sub. My favorite submarine scenes, which of course not accurate at all, are from the old 1960s, 70s Batman movie.
Oh yeah.
The fake subs. The best question
Yeah.
I would ever get is people to ask, what can you see out from it? And I was like, no, no, it wasn't a window. we were, when you're down there, but it plays with your head a bit. I think the first time we submerged, you just can't. Like, there's a lot of open space behind me. We were joking that I should be in better shape than I'm in with all the equipment in the background,
Yeah. For those that are
but
just listening,
yeah.
Neil's got a home gym, a very impressive looking home gym
Yes,
in the video.
screens this way, equipment back there. But it's interesting because you're in that for 60 some odd days in long periods. First time I went in, I had about 15 minutes of just feeling unease, and
Hmm.
just you felt everything was close to you. There was no moving out, and outside of that, kind of tucked it away in your mind, and it just became a workplace and just jobs to do, very specific, kind of real possibilities. But that carried me in. I got out. I was on an initial, I was in enlisted. I was in an initial 6 year enlistment. I came out all of a sudden as I'd done a little bit of school before, but I was a 25-year sophomore. And I was good at math and engineering. So I dropped the idea of journalism and went hard into undergraduate in finance. My MBA was an emphasis in investments. So that's really what my go-to skill set is, still finance. Underneath that, a real estate professor who chaired the finance department, I went to the University of Iowa, pulled me aside and asked if I'd ever think about real estate. And interestingly, I was coming out, talked about the Hunt for Red October as a movie. It's kind of movies like Wall Street, movies like that were out. And I was going to be a securities analyst because I was really good at math and wanted to be on the business side. And he suggested real estate. And
Hmm.
the appeal he made, and a really formative person in my early career, wound up getting me a job at Principal Financial Group to work in real estate investments, but said in real estate, when you work, any decision you make sets it on a unique path. When you're trading a stock, you can always see how things would have happened. But once you make a real estate decision, it's a unique decision, and the future you can only talk about. You don't know what the other path would have been. But said real estate's the intersection of strategy, accounting, your discipline, finance, my discipline, but legal, negotiation, marketing, all the
Hmm.
elements of business come together and are present really in almost every business decision that you make, which is where I've specialized, over time. So
Yeah. I keep going back in my mind to the book that I mentioned, so I'm going to just plug it one more
sure.
time.
Yeah.
Thunder Below by Admiral Fluckey. So one time they called him Lucky Flucky. He was a submarine captain in World War II, and he went on to become the most highly decorated living U.S. service member, in his life. For a time, he was the most highly decorated. And he did that by being the captain of a submarine called the USS Barb in World War II. And what he did was he used the submarine in what was that point the traditional way, which is right, just sneaking up on convoys of enemy ships, right? But
Right.
he also used the submarine in new ways. So, for example, he talked somebody somehow into allowing him to mount a rocket launcher to the deck of his submarine, and then he snuck into harbors in enemy territory and took out, defenses in harbors, right? And at one point they took out a train. They and then used
Yeah.
rockets to destroy a bridge, and the train crashed, right? So all these things that basically he was outside of his normal discipline, right? I bring it up again because
Yeah.
I'm just so fascinated with the way that in your time in the US Navy, you learned on submarines that you need to constantly be learning and reinventing yourself.
Yeah.
That apparently that's exactly what Admiral Fluckey learned. And now, you just tied it in beautifully with the business world, right? You might have studied finance to start with, but if you know things about real estate, about law, about accounting, HR, yeah, I mean, I could go on and on.
Yeah.
It's going to help you as you do, continuously reinvent the way you do things, and ultimately help you be more innovative in how you do your job.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. It closed the loop on a submarine, having heard your depiction of the book. So a couple of points in that, generationally, right? Like I mentioned, my wife and I have 12 kids. So generationally, and I won't indict the 12 kids, but you look to the next generations and you always feel like the next generation is softer and softer than the one that preceded you or the one that went. So in the submarine world, when you talk about World War II submarines, I mean, we looked at it like I felt like I was on like a luxury liner or a tour bus compared to what the accommodations and the hardship and frankly the operational danger that existed in World War II. And then just to close the loop from a trivia point of view, most of my time was underway on the larger ballistic missile submarines. I was on hull number 620, the USS John Adams. But when we decommissioned it and went in the shipyards and took that apart and took it out of service, I had only about a year left in the Navy and didn't have time to go and qualify on an operational command. And so a submarine was coming into Puget Sound Naval Shipyard across the sound from Seattle, and was coming into dry dock, and I got assigned to that crew. And it actually was the USS Barb,
Oh, no way.
but it was a rename in honor
Yeah.
of the USS Barb World War II submarine. One of the early nuclear fast attack boats was the USS Barb, hull number 596,
Wow.
SSN 596. If you're not familiar with how the Navy names its submarines, the SSBN or SSN. And it was 596, and it was the Barb in honor of that World War II. But I didn't realize the book, so it just kind of
Yeah.
closes the loop there.
How about
So
that? Well, that's
yeah,
fascinating.
on one of the crews I served on then at the end. So
That's so cool about the
that
Barb. Wow,
works.
we want to talk more about nVision and how Neil ended up with his office being the nicest home gym I've ever seen on a conference call. So let's talk about, you said you majored in finance and then you started working at a big corporation, right? So take
Right.
us from the big corporate world to how you ended up founding nVision, and what kind of
Yeah.
needs are you addressing in the industry?
Yeah. So one of the advantages when I first got out of the school with the emphasis in investments, it was that same real estate finance professor that I had in college that recommended real estate actually referred me into and helped me get in place at Principal Financial Group. And at the time, basically, my kids, they were younger at the time, and they would ask what I did. And I said, I basically played Monopoly for a living. We would buy properties, we would lease to corporate tenants, we had portfolios, and we managed as equity owners investment portfolio, built new buildings, got to work with our leading architects and design and construction and land planning and a lot of different job functions overseeing service providers. One of the markets that I covered for Principal Financial Group, I did some out in the mid-Atlantic coast like Washington, D.C., but before that I handled Kansas City, which is where my wife and family, we live now. But one of the parts of that job, and it's very different because now most of the work we do is corporate side. One of the unique parts about that job is 90% of our time was spent externally with service providers and tenants and things like that. And so you built a large network of relationships. And I know you and I, Matt, when we've talked frequently, we talk about what advice can you give to a younger generation. And one of the things I found later in my career on the corporate side is that a lot of times a lot of our work is internal or inward facing. All of our relationships are inside, so you don't build that rich kind of network of relationships that can be a real asset later on, both from perspective kind of benchmarking, training yourself, but also just from career wise, making sure you have the right opportunity to grow and apply your skills, because we tend to be a little bit more insular in the corporate real estate side. But my time took me to being hired by one of the service providers. I ran a large master planned office park. Again, a lot of development underwriting, a lot of working, overseeing design and construction, oversaw property management organizations, sales and marketing. So I started putting together this view. Again, if you go back to talking about submarines, this whole notion of integrated system knowledge. And I started putting together these experience that now I had the owner and I was working with a service provider, and then I had the opportunity to go run one of the brokerage firms, the Kansas City office for one of the brokerage firms. And so I kept putting together these blocks and building pieces. And later on, when I coach younger people about jobs, it's build a technical skill, be really good at something, have a go-to reference point that kind of anchors everything. And then from there, just keep building all those adjacent knowledge sets, become multidisciplined and build your knowledge base, but then also your relationship set. One of the relationships I had in Kansas City led in the kind of the .com growth era and everything like that. Sprint at the time was headquartered out of Kansas City. A friend of mine was head of strategic planning for the real estate group. And I wound up with the opportunity to go in as head of finance, as a peer position, headed up finance, performance analytics within a corporate real estate group, and did that for 2 or 3 years. At the time, there's a large industry trade organization that exists, Cornet Global. We were very well known. Sprint's team was really highly regarded in those circles, and we talked at a lot of panels, a lot of summits, a lot of different industry events. So highly recognized for what we were doing with early uses of technology. And I had a chance to chair the technology steering committee there and started looking at all these different systems that come together to allow you to plan and make decisions, which is where my focus was. And outside of that, then I had an opportunity to go work directly on the CFO staff. And so saw then the senior most decision making at the corporate level, had a great vantage point into that. But it was a very turbulent time for telecom. The other thing was, and it's an area we've spoken about a lot, is that just the demands. I mentioned earlier that my wife and I have a lot of kids, 12 to be exact. And by that point, we continued to have kids, and I was up to 8 kids. Working for a CFO of Sprint, knowing that it had some headwind challenges in front of it, and decided to just unplug. I had been in an environment where you'd done sales and all these different things, and I literally unplugged from Sprint, bought a laptop, registered with the state of Kansas, created a company 20 years ago called nVision, and it really was in pursuit of kind of working on my own midlife crisis. But the other thing is I need the flexibility to kind of work when I wanted, how I wanted, because I couldn't keep that corporate schedule. So I was a big work from home advocate long before it became the most common thread in the real estate forums of LinkedIn. So
yeah, I want to dig in a little more about the work from home and what you're doing now. But just to go back a second, you mentioned constant learning and applying, different disciplines, which we talked about a little bit already. You also mentioned the value, in your case, of Cornet, but the value of being involved, if I could paraphrase, being involved in a professional organization and sharing knowledge in that way. Also, while you could have at Sprint, for example, you could have been very internal focused, right? I'm sure you had business
Right.
partners all over. It sounds like in the real estate department, I'm sure operations, and in the finance team under the CFO, you could have spent all of your days talking with your counterparts within Sprint. But it sounds like you kind of flipped the script a little bit. You talked with people outside of your organization quite a bit, which again is very similar to talking about Cornet, which is an opportunity to
Yeah.
to talk with people and network with people outside of your immediate circle, where you work now. And it sounds like to me, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like those connections and that network, really probably gave you the platform that you needed and the contacts that you needed to start a company that's now been going strong for 20 years, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because being small, right? One of the hardest parts is any service provider walking in is to establish credibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the good fortune, like I said, the Sprint team was fairly recognized. And one of the things that I know we've had a relationship, Matt, you and I, is being instructors for their educational program, Cornet's Masters of Corporate Real Estate Continuing Education. And in 2005, going way back, I had just left. I was out on my own for about a year, and I got a call, and they were looking for instructors for a finance course.
Hmm.
And in the better to be lucky than good, you refer to the admiral who's both lucky and good. But in
Right.
the better to be lucky than good, a couple of the first people they reached out to had recommended they contact me, and I began teaching a real estate finance course. Years later, created a technology course for them, and then had a chance to sit in and on the accounting side. But what it's led to is probably having taught maybe 100 classes. There were years where I did 8 or 9. I've gotten to teach in Hong Kong and Tokyo and all over the world. But the network that you develop out of that,
Mm-hmm.
and as a small company, what it did for me is it established credibility, but allowed me to stay current and see what topics and the questions that came, and just the opportunity to listen and learn just where companies were making decisions, but build a network of relationships that included, service providers, whether it be architect, engineering, contracting firms, service providers, other end users, but just continue to just gain a perspective. And then also over time, obviously share more of what I had learned and picked up
Yeah,
along the way. So very important in that regard.
that's so encouraging. And honestly, it's been a recurring theme, not by design, but this season of the Lease Alert. Well, I've heard from so many of our guests that having a robust professional network and participating in industry trade groups for multiple industries, right? Where there are some for corporate real estate. You mentioned Cornet. There's some more focused on the tenant side, as
Right.
and one I'm specifically thinking of NRTA. And then from the accounting perspective, we've had a guest talk about the AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. And so you're right on the money. It's
Yeah.
actually an amazing theme that's developed. So I'm glad you shared that as well. Now, you mentioned 20 years, you mentioned working from home. I think you and your wife having 12 kids and raising those 12 kids now into adulthood might be more impressive than the nuclear submarine part. But
Yeah, it's
I know
become the
you.
bigger. Yeah, it's become the bigger. Like, you wind up in nuclear. It's like, tell me something about yourself that you wouldn't know. And usually, it's the easy ones, the 12 kid thing, because that's fairly uncommon.
Yeah,
So
you did that out of necessity. Well, you founded nVision and started working from home out of necessity.
yeah,
But now, I mean, what a hot topic, in the wake of COVID, right? I mean,
right,
work from home, this hybrid concept or return to office, whatever you call it, it's a major hot topic, and folks are really still adjusting. And I think you probably have some lessons learned if you founded nVision and you've been working from home for 20 years now. What have you learned along the way, just specifically related to balancing a professional presence and having to meet with people, right? I mean, it's a relationship
right.
business, and but also working from home, as your primary office.
Yeah, yeah. Mine is, I think, a lot of the lessons that you pick up as you go over time. So loop way back to the beginning, we were talking about the importance of learning.
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of growth, right? So obviously, I've dropped enough dates that if someone sat down and took a piece of paper out and did the math, right, they'd realize that I've been around doing this a while, right? But things that people usually are surprised about is I was talking to somebody yesterday. So in Vision, we don't get hired to manage things that are already going right. We're like tip of the spear. We only deal with things that people think are impossible or hard to do. So
Mm-hmm.
we constantly are out finding ways to innovate and kind of push the boundaries. So a big one is continue to learn. Like I will still invest 12 to 15 hours a week on top of a busy schedule, just learning, absorbing. And a lot of times it's technical, the software, things like that, because it's always changing. But a lot of times, to your point, reading, acquire knowledge, relationships, growth, personal growth on that side. So one is that's hugely important. The hard part with me kind of being more established and doing this for a long time, it's easy for me. I'm a person that's described as never working and always working at the same time. So you try to always be available and
Mm-hmm.
prioritize what's around you, but work routines. But the biggest one for people that work from home is to stay connected. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times out within that personal network, people that push you, people that give you, advice, kind of check you in, just critically important. But it's
Mm.
having a balance and a variety in your time, because don't wind up as a node, like a spoke that's removed from the hub, and take work from home and then become disconnected. You have to find ways to stay engaged, both relationship wise, learning wise, and obviously, just the content and what you produce. So big lessons on my side.
Fantastic. Great advice. So, Neil, tell us if somebody wants to work with nVision, they've heard the podcast, they're like, oh, I
Yeah.
don't care what he's offering. I need to work with Neil. But where do you plug in? Like, what are you helping corporations with right now?
Well, ironically, because of the finance side, one of the things coming from the investment side, which was every dollar out the door was very measured. How productive is our money? That's the
Mm-hmm.
nature of investments. And so there was a lot of very detailed and deep financial analysis was kind of built into the very fabric of working on the investor side. When I came over through the service provider route into the corporate real estate side, and now I teach, like I said, the corporate real estate finance course for Cornet. But one of the things is that the finance discipline actually is fairly low in a relative sense. It's not that on the corporate side is less intelligence or it's less challenging. It's the fact is we deal with a lot of different things, interacting with business units, the design of buildings, wellness, productivity, building operations. There's just a lot of different topics. But on my side, a lot of what we do is finance themed. It's decisions. And we wound up focused on how companies plan and make decisions, because traditionally corporate real estate organizations, you may need to consolidate from 3 buildings to one in Dallas, and you organize a team and you go in to do that. But you've got somebody working on something in Dallas, you've got somebody working on something in London, you've got somebody working on something maybe in San Francisco or Seattle. And those projects, having run the performance analytics groups at these companies, you've got all these underlying systems that impact decision making. You've got all these isolated projects that impact decision making. And even in the time we're taping this, spreadsheets are the dominant tools. Let's
Mm.
extract all that information and start to work. So years ago, we started building planning methods and tools. And
Mm-hmm.
going back, like we were very early adopters of BI, business intelligence, and dashboarding, like as early as, I don't know, 2006, we were putting portfolio modeling into visual tools that were well ahead of our time. Now it's turned into all the data science, the big data, the ability to take data from all those source systems, build portfolio planning. And what was fortuitous for us is we were starting to look at attendance and demand behaviors and how much space you need, and tying that together into portfolio plans before COVID. And so then coming off of COVID, you could build one plan for like everybody's coming back in the office, and then the
Mm-hmm.
executive asks the question, what if far fewer people come back in the office, or what if specifically these people don't come back in? And it has a huge ripple effect across your whole plan. Well, if it's built manually in spreadsheets, it's hard to communicate, hard to consolidate. We take care of all that. So we do in
Mm.
minutes what a lot of other groups frankly take weeks.
Oh, yeah.
to do manually because we just run scenarios. And then by leveraging a lot of data science in that, we had a lot of great clues on where to start. But one of the design features we do is we're just not at a point where we trust the black box yet, whether it's AI or data science driven
Hmm.
approaches. So we let those types of things create scenarios just like another planner would create. But then if I'm next to the system generated versions of what we do, I can simply clone, copy, and perform the act. It'll create a plan just like a planner would. It's to a point that we can drop in and just as another planner, we can take, oh, well, let's not keep that lease. Let's do a different one. A lot of
Hmm.
tools like AI side and everything like that just comes to real estate. We tend to black box the actual algorithms. And so you get a result, share it with a business unit. They tell you they don't like it. You're done. You can't touch the middle.
Hmm.
And in our approach, you can get at it and
Yeah.
do everything manually as a planner if you want to take and refine and iterate based on feedback or unique factors that didn't make it into your models. So it's like I said, we don't do the easy stuff, but we're able to take and speed up decision time and make better decision. Built-in financial analysis, of course, because
Yeah.
that's the basic wiring. That's always the go-to, that preferred high technical skill. So
Yeah. Oh, that's incredible. Well, I can see how that is quite in demand in today's environment. So I know you're really busy. We're going to give contact information in the show
sure.
notes if anybody wants to learn more about nVision. But Neil, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it always, Matt. I think it's great that you share this out because I think a lot of, particularly we talk about in the connected side, where do people go to learn? How do they stay with an external perspective? So I appreciate you taking the time out of your calendar and doing this, not just with me, but everyone else you've done in this series. Thanks again.
Oh yeah, happy to do it. Thank you for listening to the Lease Alert. I'd be grateful if you would like and subscribe wherever you listen. Until next time, keep learning and leasing.